Hello, my name's Hugh and I'm Director of the RSCM. The Royal School of Church Music is an independent charity whose mission is to nurture and support effective music in worship. We do this by supporting church music and musicians at all ages and stages. The challenges of the last COVID-dominated year have made it necessary for us to rethink, time and again, what we can best be doing to keep the flame of church music burning brightly, and we will not give up in this task. We are not fixated on a glorious past, though we build with pride on our 94 years of work so far. We're more concerned with the education work of now and into the future. We have lots of exciting new plans coming to fruition. You can play a part. You might want to sign up to attend one of our webinars, events or courses. Or you might want to be involved as a volunteer with our newly relaunching Area Teams network. To the surprise of many, the RSCM does not receive funding from either the church or the state, and we're grateful for the support of all of those who enable us to carry out our work. You might consider becoming a financial supporter yourself, perhaps as a friend of the RSCM. Whatever it is, we hope you will want to share with us on our journey into the future. We value the chance to connect with you and warmly encourage you to be in touch. Wherever you are, and whatever your own circumstance, we hope you will see that the RSCM is there alongside you. Thank you for joining us. Well, hello and a very good afternoon. It's lovely to welcome you to join us for this webinar today from the RSCM. You'll see that actually, having just watched that video that was pre-recorded by me some time ago, I'm in the same space at an ever so slightly different angle because of a preceding session I've been leading with a different IT system. So today is a webinar where we're looking around and reflecting on some of the challenges of the last year and discussing some of the ways that have been dealt with, and looking forward to share hopes and visions for the future of this really important, living tradition of church music, of which the RSCM is so passionately keen to nurture and support. The panellists today include a director of music and a composer and a singer and a liturgist, and they consider some of the ways that rebuilding the music in a post-pandemic situation might represent. Before we get to it, there are a few necessary sort of pre-flight checks, if you like, that we ought to take from just make sure everyone's led through. And of course, I should have said that if you haven't met me, my name is Hugh Morris and I am the director of the RSCM, and it's a delight for me to chair today's discussion. So this webinar is being recorded and it will be available for download in its entirety afterwards. I think it's from our web shop, so we'll make that details clear. Someone who's attending live as you have the added advantage that you can ask questions. The chat isn't enabled, but the Q&A is. So if you've got a question that you'd like to ask the panel today, then do use the Q&A to type it in. The technical host, which for us today is Sam, will help manage that. And we'll either answer as we go through or save those to the end. So just remember that everything you see, because this is a recorded thing and it's a public scenario, everything that you put in the question and answer situation, or if you were to be asked to speak in some way, which we can enable if necessary, needs to reflect that. And just for safeguarding reasons, I need to remind you that any under 18s watching this should only attend this if they're accompanied by an adult. I think the only other thing I should say is that the attendees are not visible to each other. That's because this is in the webinar format of Zoom. If you're very familiar with Zoom things online at home and you can see the rest of your family and whatever, it's not like that today. It's more like the scenario in a hall where up at the front is a panel sitting on the stage, and we'll come to introduce those in a second. And at the very end, just to say sorry, but you won't be able to reach any of the participants. It just closes and we'll go on to the rest of our day. So it is, I think at that point, excellent to be able to welcome the panel today. So why don't we just get each of the panelists to briefly introduce themselves, starting with no significance to the order at all. Vicky, it's lovely to have you joining us from York.
Thank you. I'm Vicky Johnson. I'm the Precentor at York Minster. I started here in January 2020 and then basically almost immediately went into lockdown. So I've been working here for just over 15 months.
Quite an eye-opening time in the life of York Minster to be part of, I know, because with conversations with others from there. So, as we know, challenging times. But thank you. We look forward to hearing you sharing your experiences. Anna Lapwood is next on my list here. Anna, welcome.
Hello, I'm Anna. I'm the Director of Music at Pembroke College in Cambridge. I've been working there for nearly 5 years now, which seems completely ridiculous. I'm sure that's making Sarah shudder a little bit as well. And we have two main choirs at Pembroke, a chapel choir and a girls' choir. So it's been quite interesting seeing how they interact slightly differently with the pandemic and cope with it.
And perhaps I should even introduce yourselves, but and actually, Vicky, maybe we should come back to you about the York. So I'll come back to you because I didn't ask this question of you, but some of the things that have sort of been and roughly possible musically and liturgically over the last year. So you've had periods, presumably, Anna, where you haven't been meeting in person.
Yeah, so we were allowed to meet at the very beginning of this academic year for about 3 weeks, and then it shut down. We went back on Zoom, and then we had a whole term of Zoom, and now we're finally back in person. I don't want to jinx anything, so I'm touching everything wooden that I can find around me. We're allowed to meet again, and so we're tentatively starting to rebuild everything at the moment.
Excellent. Well, that's at least a positive narrative on that. Should we move on and then just say, Anna mentioned Sarah. So Sarah MacDonald, it's great to have you with us, Sarah.
I'm Sarah MacDonald. I'm Director of Music at Selwyn College, Cambridge, where I have been for nearly as long as Anna Lapwood has been alive. And I also run the girl choristers at Ely Cathedral. I've been very fortunate at Selwyn in that we have carried on all the way through every lockdown, well, not the first one, obviously, but all of this academic year, singing in person, often remotely, so with no congregation, but the chapel choir has been allowed to continue with sometimes as few as 5 or 6 singers, if that's all that was in residence for the first part of the Lent term in particular. The Ely girls, obviously, because they're all at a school, they've only come back since schools reopened in March. So we had a very good first term rebuilding, having not sung at all in the summer term, but we're still rebuilding, and a lot of the girls are very young. They've only been in the choir for a year or two, of which several months they haven't been in the choir. So it's a real rebuilding process.
And of course, that's one of the things that we might pick up as we go on and think of some of those things. And so the last of today's panel is Caroline Summers. So maybe you'd like to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Hugh. Hello, everyone. My name's Caroline. I'm a lay clerk at Derby Cathedral, where I have been for 9 years now, which I didn't realise until I did the maths for this. So, but I've been singing in church choirs for about 25 years, and I do lots of other singing as well. So it's been interesting for me as a singer, the differences between church choirs and non-liturgical choirs and what's been allowed and possible even. In a positive sense. For the church side of things, so that's mostly been my experience. And at Derby, we've done a combination of no singing, cantor singing, lay clerks only singing, trebles only singing. Just in November, quickly, everyone all together before the next lockdown. And at the moment, everyone's singing together at least for some parts of the week. So again, it's a fingers crossed, positive for the moment.
And of course, I think that's one of the things, isn't it, about we have to, well, it's lovely to hear already the sort of positive mindset that people have been putting out as part of this, and people showing what is that phrase that keeps coming back, which is sort of, to me at least, the art of the possible, about what one can do in these situations, and about the fact that there's something that we can celebrate, being able to do things a little bit at the moment. Vicky, since we didn't ask you, or at least I didn't ask you, and that was remiss of me, I'm sorry about some of the sort of off and ons of the last year at York. Why don't we actually then make that, why don't you sort of join the two things together and maybe say about what sort of the ins and outs of services, no services, online services have been at York, and then perhaps just begin the process of saying about, well, what you're looking at now as things open up again.
Yeah, thank you. The last year has been a challenge in many ways, and here at York we've had some sadnesses to deal with the closure of the Minster School here, but also some joys with our work with St Peter's in York. So our choristers have transitioned there, and they are now singing in bubbles with the back row daily services, full psalmody. So we're really pleased about that. And I think in the last year, like every place of worship, we too have been in and out of the building throughout the year. We've embraced new technology in terms of live streaming and also maintained congregations on Zoom. And I think now, through all of that, with the great team here at York, we are beginning to rebuild and reset and think about the future. And we're trying to do that positively, really. And look at what we've learned in the last year and how we might take things forward. So I think that kind of summarises the huge journey that we've all been on here, but also the possibilities for the future. And of course, I shouldn't neglect to mention the wonderful resurrection of the Minster organ as well during lockdown, which has given us a great deal of hope and inspiration for the future. So we're really thinking about how to rebuild all of these things and kind of walk confidently into the future in terms of liturgy and worship.
So thank you, Vicky. So where we are now, and we're thinking about this confidence, perhaps, and about giving people the confidence to make the decisions to think about what they're going to do. So where are you in terms of things like how you're going about? I think this is the thing that is helpful for people to understand the sorts of things that are going through. Now we've got a range of experiences here, and so let's get the different opinions about things like how you're doing risk assessments and thinking about how you're doing flexibility and responding quickly to situations and coping with the fact that suddenly somebody's having to self-isolate and so forth. And of course, the ever critical question about how you're coping with distancing, which it has to be said in the building of York Minster is less of an issue for you than perhaps it is in some other circumstances, but we might come to that. So Vicky, do you want to start by thinking about some of that, and then let's get some of the others to join in freely?
Yeah, of course, we're following all the Church of England risk assessments and guidance, some of that through the RSCM, which has been hugely helpful. And so that there is a complexity about actually allowing worship to happen at the moment. And I think we all recognise that. But I think what we're trying to do here in York is think beyond that. To think beyond the day-by-day challenges of cleaning, of risk assessments, of distancing in the building, and actually think more positively about where we're heading. And I think you need that optimism to really move forward at the moment. We do have a huge building, but that presents issues in terms of acoustics and in terms of spacing for singers. So there are lots of challenges that kind of continually emerge day by day in our context.
Maybe some of the other singers, Sarah.
I was just going to address this very good question about congregational singing, which of course is so frustrating, and especially if they're wearing masks, there doesn't seem to be any reason why they should.
So it might just be worth reprising the conversation, because if everybody hasn't got the questions open on their screen, they won't be able to see it. So, yes.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So the question is, there are so many churches, still many churches around the country which are not using live music, with the excuse that if people can't sing, what's the point? Although one could argue that praying without singing might be the point, but the use of the organ obviously can make a big difference, even if it's just organ music or a cantor. The question here is, when will we be allowed to tell congregations that they can sing again, even behind masks? Well, I can tell you a couple of clergy I know who have been perfectly happy to tell people that no one knows if you're humming behind your mask, even now. I don't know whether that's allowed or not, but so, and certainly what we're doing in Selwyn and in Ely is the choir is singing the hymns on behalf of the congregation, which is very frustrating, I am sure. But I think my answer to that would be any kind of live music at any, even if the congregation can't sing, will make the musicians themselves feel a bit better. If you can bring your poor organist off of furlough and let him play a bit, even just playing some hymns that just to remind people, even if they know they're not supposed to sing, that's going to that's going to make people feel better. And musicians in particular, of course, have suffered so much not being able to do what they do.
Specifically,
They tell time to go outside and sing.
that's it. It's possible for
Summer's coming.
How's your experience of doing that as a singer been, Caroline, singing outside?
Fortunately, I've only had to sing outside in a non-professional capacity, so quality has been less of a concern for me. I've only sung outside as a congregational member rather than as a member of the choir. So my local parish church, where I sometimes go on a Sunday morning, is currently practicing last hymn, Everyone Outside. So the choir stand and lead the singing, but obviously there's no organ accompaniment, which has its own challenges, but it means we all get to join in with a bit of singing. And I think also, partly because of where the church is, there are a lot of people coming past, and it's in terms of mission and the church and waking people up to the fact that the church is there again. I think it's lovely, actually. And it's on Christmas morning we did it, and it's the best singing I did all Christmas, just because it felt like I was participating in something rather than just delivering, I guess, which is how it has at times felt, I think, within the building of the church, because at Derby, for example, we sing at the moment entirely in the retrochoir space, which is east of the altar, miles away from the clergy, miles away from any congregation who might be there. And so the singing at the moment is 10 out of 10 for safety, but quite low in terms of feeling a response from people in the building and feeling part of the worship, even because everything else is so far away.
Absolutely, and it would be interesting to hear others' reflections on that. That distance thing actually might be something that we could come back with Anna and Sarah about how you've done this in reality. Just to respond to that part of the question about, well, for Peter's question, when we'll be allowed to tell congregations that the guidance. I was in a meeting last week about this, and there is a deep understanding that people want to be able to sing again. They everything, of course, relates to everything else, and so the Church of England has been directly talking with government about it, and they know it's a no pun intended live issue, and we're awaiting the sort of scientific input into various things. So the answer is it's a generally gently positively forward progress, but I don't think it's all going to change next week, is what it amounts to. Shall we then pick up with Anna? Come on, so perhaps do come in and share some of your thoughts on the sort of things like the distancing and how that's been.
Yeah, I think it's been quite different with both choirs. So the girls' choir seemed to just sort of shrug their shoulders and go, fine, we're not standing next to each other, we'll just get on with it. Chapel choir, I think, found it slightly harder, and I realise that makes sense given that they are singing in more parts, whereas the girls' choir tend to be singing one line altogether. So there's more sort of collective support, shall we say, for the girls' choir. But something that I have found really interesting in the last couple of weeks is the implication of having to have the door open the whole time and the effect on the organ. I mean, it sounds silly, but our buildings are so used to having this kind of, they follow the church season, they're used to having the humidity varying a little bit, but not a huge amount. And now suddenly, after this extended period of time where we've all had to have our doors open and not that many people in the building, our organ is just, it's basically gone on strike. I mean, it essentially exploded when I was playing it last week, and we had to have the emergency organ builder come and try and sort it out. And I think this is something we shouldn't overlook in the planned return, the effect on the buildings themselves and the instruments that we're dealing with and how we can safeguard those.
Absolutely, and that's and understanding that there are consequences, and so I think that's where it's helpful that musicians potentially have something to a voice to be thought of, to be listened to. I mean, in that situation. Sarah, do you have anything to add on the sort of your experiencing of the distance and that sort of side of things?
My experiences has been surprisingly positive. Obviously, it's difficult, and especially things like Psalms, when the choir is spread out over, well, whatever, 30 meters times 2 meters squared, whatever. Things have to be rehearsed more. But I have certainly found that, I have a very young choir at Selwyn this year with a lot of first years, and they are way better now than they should be, if you see what I mean, because they've had no one to hide behind. Basically, if they don't sing it, it's not going to happen. And so they've developed, by the end of the first term, they had developed so much more independence. That was great. And actually, I think I might keep some of that, probably not in services, but maybe in rehearsals at the beginning of the year, and just get people to stand further away from each other. It's funny, the risk assessment thing I was going to say, we have, you know, you have to have a risk assessment for everything. So there's so much more admin before you do anything. But like Anna was saying with the organ tuning, the added expense we have is that our choir vestry is too small for them to distance in. So undergraduates are keeping their cassocks and surplices in their rooms. So I've actually added extra money to the budget for next year to replace the ones that don't survive. And that's thanks to the risk assessment.
Indeed, it's these are things that sort of aren't in people's first thinking, but it's the actual reality of life, isn't it? So, is there anything else before we move on to another topic? Perhaps is there anything else that the group would like to add on this? There's a question come in. There's a slightly different point, so maybe we'll come to that in a moment. We'll leave that one just sitting for a moment. It's lovely that we've got people joining us from the US. So, good morning to you. Why don't we just move on to something then? Thinking, okay, so we've had to change all sorts of things, haven't we? And the old order changeth, as in the words of the there's a lovely anthem of that, isn't there? Some of it, though, everyone will be delighted to eventually perhaps say goodbye to, but some of it, the implication is that we might actually keep it. And so, Sarah, maybe just give us some thoughts as to things that actually aren't quite so bad. You just talked about one with sort of singers getting a bit more independent. That's good. Are there other things?
Well, I like the idea of everyone washing their hands before they do anything. I think we should keep that. And one of the things that I have really enjoyed is actually mixing up the repertoire. And, you know, the other day we did, even though the whole choir was present, we did an anthem, an intro with just the sopranos and altos. Whereas normally I wouldn't program that because we didn't have a women's voices service at the right time of year, so we didn't get to sing that piece. But actually, why shouldn't we? You know, and all of last term when I had started the term with 6 choral scholars in residence, by the end of term there were 11 or 12 as they gradually came back. I was composing a lot every week, you know, and at one point I had 6 singers on the books at Thursday morning. 2 of them then had what turned out to be a false positive test in the asymptomatic testing screen. So I only had 3 for the service. So we had, you know, the invention of this lovely set of faux bourdons called the isolation faux bourdons, dedicated to the 3 that were stuck in their rooms that day. You know, that was great. I felt much more creative that way. I'll just answer this, the handling paper music copies, answering live. As long as their hands are clean and they're sanitized, it's fine. And certainly, you know, the libraries around the world, and certainly in Cambridge, stopped quarantining books an awfully long time ago. The sanitization of hands is the important bit. So you can actually hand a piece of paper to your neighbor. You can't share copies, not because you'll get COVID, but because you're 2 meters away from each other. So.
Unless you, of course, you go back to sort of some modern version of the enormous big choir books, in which case that would presumably be entirely possible. Anna, so why don't you share some of the things that you've that you actually are thinking, oh yeah, actually we're going to keep this?
I think I would echo what Sarah was saying about being a bit more thinking outside the box in terms of repertoire. And I think what better way to push everyone to think differently about repertoire than basically stop them doing all the music that they're used to doing the whole time without wanting to be too cynical about it. I think the other thing is that having, at the moment, we're sort of hybrid. So some things are on Zoom and some people are in the room. And it means that we have a couple of people who haven't returned to Cambridge, but they can still join in with everything that's going on. And I think that is something that's quite exciting because, yes, people are going to get ill and people are going to be away and miss choir practices and things, and having the ability for them to join in anyway, I think is really important. The one other thing that I would say is a positive, and I guess it's sort of indirectly related, I just feel like I've become much more aware of the individual needs of each singer and tailoring bits and pieces to suit them. And I think that's partly because they're so much more exposed, because they aren't standing near their friends, or not necessarily friends, probably friends because they're in a choir together, near their people who are singing their own part. You just kind of sense when something's not quite right. So I ended up doing sort of 4 hours going through things individually with tenors and basses because we needed it to get them back on track. And actually, I think that interaction between conductor and singers is really important. Sometimes you need to go, the problem isn't the big, it's the individuals, the small. We need to go into detail and make sure they are enjoying it as much as possible.
Let's look at it from Caroline with her. And by the way, so the question about the copies thing. Do you have any view on that, Anna? About whether are you using photocopies or real copies, or are you going to go back to? Or using
yeah, we are at the moment just making sure that all copies are on chairs well in advance of the rehearsal, and everyone has to sanitize at every available opportunity. But we're not quarantining. As Sarah said, I think the university library stopped quarantining books quite a long time ago, and we've all followed that.
And that is a fairly authoritative. Cambridge University Library is a fairly sort of authority sort of thing, isn't it? So, Caroline, what about you from your experience? Is there anything of this with your singer's hat on? Is there anything about the current life that you think, yeah, actually, this is good?
I love the fact that the copies are just in a folder on my chair and I don't have to join the scrum at the pigeonhole to find them every service. It's perfect for me, but I imagine it's a lot of work for somebody else. So, I'm not sure that everyone on the Cathedral staff would agree with me, but I think for me individually as a singer, I've actually enjoyed standing further apart and singing further apart for some music, because I've been able to hear more clearly what's going on around me, I think. But I know that that doesn't work for everybody. I think one thing, again, it's repertoire. One thing that I've really learnt from the lockdown singing and the different singing is not just new repertoire, but repertoire that often I wouldn't sign up for, let's say, because I would say, oh, it's a bit simple. I'd rather do something that's got 4 parts, maybe even 8. And definitely some loud noises in the background. And actually, I come to realise that there's something very wonderful and beautiful about just some plain chant. I did a couple of services as a cantor, and for me, that was very surprising, actually, because I felt possibly more involved in the worship than I would do if I were just standing as part of the choir. And I think it really opened my eyes to the value of music in worship, but also the connection between the music and the worship. And I think that's something that I will certainly take forward. Not that I didn't feel connected to the worship before, but I think it's just made me realise how important it is that music can be part of not every service, but some worship. And I think the other thing is I've seen from Derby, but from other cathedrals as well, I think I've seen some really good streamed or pre-recorded worship that has made it possible for people who aren't in the building to be in the building in some way. And I think that's also something very valuable. I think especially in churches that have older congregations, people who maybe will still be shielding for a long time or feel anxious for a long time, it's important for us to think about, once we're allowed to be all back in the building, not just dropping everything that we have been doing to take ourselves outside the building. So yeah, I think the other thing that that has been reinforced for me is how important the social side of choir is actually for singers, because the least satisfying thing is trying to do a Zoom recording to be part of, or even sing together on Zoom, no way. But I think even just not being able to be in the room but not actually talk to people properly is quite challenging. And we all sing because we love singing, and actually to be with people who also love doing that and to chat to each other is part of the fun. So that's something that has been yes, my appreciation has been rekindled for that aspect of singing. So it's not necessarily something that I would want to continue from the way we've been doing it in lockdown, but it's certainly a positive that I would take forward. Yeah.
Now, there's various aspects about that we might just come back to in a minute, Caroline. You sort of left lots of teasers there, actually. But
sorry.
Lots and lots of nods in that last bit from Vicky. So I wonder whether maybe she'd like to just share some of her thoughts about things that you might be keeping, or things that York Minster, oh thank goodness, we can sort of see a way out of this.
I want to dwell on the things that we might keep, actually, because we've, like lots of cathedrals, we've done a lot of experimentation and creative thinking in the last year. And some of the joys for us have been little things. Caroline talked about the plain song, and we've used a lot of plain song here. We've used the organ a lot within the liturgy. So we've used the organ to surround worship, as it were, throughout each act of worship. We've introduced a middle voluntary. We did that last summer at Evensong to kind of give a sort of depth and a sort of range of music in worship. And we've also commissioned pieces in lockdown. We commissioned 3 pieces. Sarah wrote one of them, which was fantastic, because in a way, I suppose worship always reflects the context you're in, doesn't it? And we've had a difficult year. So I think what I'm trying to reflect on is what kind of tone we're setting musically and liturgically and spiritually going forward, and how we can work together as musicians and liturgists to create that response. So I think there is something about lament and challenge and being thoughtful about what we've all gone through, whilst also looking forward positively and joyfully to the fact that we're hopefully moving through it. So I think some of those things that Caroline was touching on about the importance of worship and what that means, and the fact that worship still happens even without music, but music is a gift that we're given to lift worship. And I think it's important to remember all of that as we go forward, to be grateful for the gift we have, and to use it well going forward. So those are some of my thoughts. We've had things that have been difficult too, but I think the live streaming has really reached thousands of people who would not ordinarily be able to participate in the worship that we offer.
Now, before we Anna, go on.
Can I just come in on something on the live streaming? And I realise this might link onto some of the things we're planning on discussing later down the line. I think live streaming is so great, and I think it has been an interesting process for us to all change our relationship with mistakes and perfection and all of that side of things. But I am still having younger players and younger singers coming to me and expressing their anxiety surrounding the fact that everything is now streamed. And I feel the same. Some of my concerts, you look back and you go, I really don't want that to be on the internet forever. And luckily, a lot of places are saying, right, we'll take it down. But I just think we need to be aware in our sort of duty as teachers and educators and supporters of young people that it's very stressful for your first ever solo to be something that is actually streamed on the internet for everyone to see. And one of the things that's so special about our church choir communities is giving those young people the safe space that allows them to do their first solo with just the choir parents and that lovely, caring, nurturing environment. We've suddenly got a camera in there and it's very, very different.
And actually, you've just begun to touch on, and of course, we're talking much of the sort of the conversation so far has been sort of around innovation in places where there's lots of innate resources available, and obviously, somewhere like York Minster or some of the Cambridge colleges and things have got the wherewithal to make that possible, and the staffing and so forth. What about? Do you think? Maybe you talked about your local church, Caroline, earlier. Some of the sort of the challenges that smaller churches are facing and how they've approached to some of the kind of what has and hasn't been possible and so forth.
Yeah, I think I would summarise it by saying resources, whether that's financial or more practical things like space. I know that, so in my local parish church, for example, they've been singing, they're still singing in groups of 6 or 7, that's all they can safely manage, and that's with at least one person standing somewhere behind the organ in the chancel, so they can't really see very well, and it's very difficult. So for spacing out, it's a lot more difficult in a smaller church. I think also, coming back to some things we've already discussed, so things like confidence, I think where those of us who sing and are lucky enough to be paid to do it might enjoy the opportunity to sing one to a part in a parish church choir where people are there not just because they love singing, but also because they want to contribute to worship, and they maybe don't feel that they're the best singer in the world. It's actually quite challenging to suddenly be, well, you're a soprano, so you're today's soprano, if you're not comfortable with that. And that comes back to some of the things that Anna was saying as well about anxiety. And I guess this is mostly about the intersection between the way that singing is performance, and so we all want it to be the best we can do, but also in the liturgical setting it's functional, and so it has to happen, and so it's a conflict of interest, I guess, for all of us when we're doing it. I think friends of mine who sing in good parish church choirs have felt that it's frustrating because when there's a rota, often you just get what you're given on the rota, and so there might be services where you look at the music list and you quite like to sing that, but it's not your day, so all you can do is sit and listen, which is also good, but it's frustrating, I think, because there is less opportunity to expand, while some of the bigger churches and cathedrals are now starting to expand what's happening because we have space. There's also, I suppose it's more precarious because there is a reliance on households, perhaps a little bit more in parish music making, because where families are a big part of the church choir, if they all have to isolate suddenly, there's a big hole, or potentially there's a hole. So I think outside of cathedral music making and big, well-resourced liturgical music making, there's still quite a lot of anxiety and problem solving going on, because things are just more limited. I think it's frustrating, and but I think we'll all get there in the end. I hope.
Just comment on that, just to say that's where we, in all our various different sort of relative speaking, we have to understand that it's okay not to be too ambitious. So on the day that, if you find yourself in a small parish church where you've got your organist and you've got one singer from the choir who's not terribly experienced, you don't need to, do whatever that handle, eternal light, radiant light, or whatever. You can just get that person to sing a hymn, and that in itself is sufficient, and accompanied hymn. Or even if you've got 4 singers who nominally are soprano, alto, tenor, bass, it's okay to sing in unison as well, and that's certainly what I'm finding, trying to rebuild a treble line. Actually it's okay to sing in unison, and in fact it's really healthy to sing in unison, and that gives them confidence even if they're standing too far away from each other. And it was funny, actually, even just yesterday in Selwyn, I did something which I would normally never do. Now, I haven't actually done a music list for the term yet, because I'm still waiting to find out how the very complicated exam process is going to affect who's available when. And so I'm doing service music lists a bit sort of one at a time. On the first Thursday back, we live streamed, but something had gone wrong and there was no sound on the live stream. So we took this service down, and it was very frustrating, but it was fine. Anyway, yesterday we did the same anthem, because, the 2 wardens who'd come to the service on the first day back, because no one knew it was happening, they didn't mind hearing it again. And the rest of the world hadn't heard it. And the congregation, the students have really started to come back to chapel now, because there's not much else going on yet, I guess. And they were all very happy to listen to it again. Normally I would not repeat something with a Cambridge choir 10 days later, but why not? And actually saved me 20 minutes of rehearsal time as well. And they really enjoyed the chance to sing something again that they already knew. So that's okay.
Can I just pick up? So there's lots of questions coming in. It's lovely to have this input. And so just trying to sort of balance between all of the sort of topics that we sort of thought that we would talk about versus some of these comments coming in. Just to, if I could just see what thoughts of the panel are about, before we come back to the question from Pete Seaton about distance. But it sort of feeds to this one from Jeanette and I. Our building is very small. If we space the choir as advised, there's no room for congregation, and singers in small groups aren't really viable because the singers aren't confident enough. That's sort of what you were talking a bit about, Sarah, but I don't know if any of the rest of you have got any advice for Jeanette and the people like Jeanette in that sort of circumstances to how to kind of respond to that.
I mean, I'm happy to jump in on this, though please shut me up if someone else wants to talk. We have made the decision not to have congregations so that we can have slightly larger groups of singers. And actually we did one thing with the full choir yesterday, but for most of term we're just having half of the choir at a time. And we could have had in terms of our college rules, we could have had 6 singers and a congregation, but we thought actually for this term, given that they haven't been able to sing together properly for such a long time, we're going to prioritise having them in the building together and streaming everything, or recording it and then putting it out later. So I would say give your choir something to kind of do together, and even just set up you don't have to have a big fancy streaming setup, just set up a camera and film it, and then drop that into services or find a way to distribute it as part of worship. And hopefully that can help sort of bridge this gap until we get back to time when we don't need to have a giant stadium-sized building to sing together.
Which leads, I suppose, that back to the question that that was posed by Peter Seaman about how long you think it's going to be before spaces are the social distancing thing is going to be removed from singers, and I thought that it might be a year. That you heard that from another webinar, and I think the jury's out on that, Peter, because there's no the sort of, even, you know, we haven't returned the RSCM office staff to the office yet because we're still waiting pending the decision on how far apart they have to sit and all of these things, and of course, you know, it's not just singing that's affected by this. But the non-distance thing, well, that's part of a sort of ongoing narrative, and there are groups considering this. If it's a reassurance to you, I absolutely can say that there are at sort of the highest level discussions going on, but there aren't firm resolutions yet because, of course, people are all still planning in the short term. What should we? Maybe the next topic that we might pick up is around this whole streaming of services and technology pros and cons. And there's some. So here's one question from Mark. With the use of modern technology such as congregation live streamings, would it be preferable to use pre-recorded hymns or just live stream or live stream a choir singing? Any thoughts on that one? And then we'll come to streaming itself in a minute, but let's just pick up that question.
I can say, oh, sorry, Sarah, you go.
I was just going to say, I don't know that I completely understand the question. Is this as in, like, so you would have a recording running during the service as opposed to having human beings singing? I
guess that's the question, isn't it? I don't know if there is actually a platform. I haven't come across it called Congregation Live. Because the way it's capitalised might be, I suppose. It depends on Mark. I've got no idea where you're joining us from. Would it be preferable to use that rather than attempt to microphone? I guess. I mean, I guess if you've got a very proficient choir, it's fine. But is there a notion that saying rather than stream a choir, and they weren't so sort of confident in doing that, you'd be better off streaming a pre-recorded thing? That's a contention. What would your response be?
I suppose I would rather have live music, and even if it wasn't the best live music of all time, I would always rather have live music, and that's why I have refused ever to do another virtual choir in my life, ever, for example, because it's not real. And I don't object to recordings, but if you've got people who can do it in real life, and you've got the room to do it, then I would say do that, but that's my opinion.
Others?
I would agree. When I did the cantoring services over the summer last year, because it was only one voice, we used pre-recorded hymns piped in as part of the service, and I found it very weird experience to listen to so many voices singing and not actually see the people singing, and it was a strange mixture of live and pre-recorded. And I think I certainly agree with Sarah that it's more in the spirit of music in the church to have somebody there doing it, even if it's not perfect or complicated, than to pre-record something and have something extremely sophisticated but not actually there. Yeah.
We did a similar thing with sermons last term, or whenever it was, a couple of terms ago, where we had preachers sort of beamed in on a massive screen. And I found it really interesting talking to the choir about it. And they just said it felt like suddenly our special bubble of our church community had been like burst into by someone else who wasn't actually in the building at all. And they said they found it quite disruptive. And I wonder if it's a similar thing with hymn singing. It suddenly makes you realise that there's more than just that small community, and that can be one of the lovely things about worship, is having that feeling that you are just all there together and engaging in the act of worship as one. The moment you add in kind of some random people singing, I don't know, get a recording of St. Paul's, you're quickly reminded that that community is a bit fractured at the moment.
I would just love to jump in there after Anna and agree with that. That I think the whole events of the last year have forced us to consider what worship actually is, and I think that's good for all of us, clergy and musicians, and how we enable worship to happen, in all these different forms and all these different circumstances that we find ourselves, that it is the worship of God that we're all aiming for. Sorry, I'm biased, obviously comes with the job. But I think if we keep our focus right, then whatever we offer, wherever we are, is worship. And it doesn't matter if it's one person in a tiny church or something like we're doing at York Minster, which has had its challenges. We've had challenges here too. So it's about getting our focus right, about what worship is and what it's for. And I think that does raise questions about the live streaming and the challenges that live streaming can bring into that conversation.
Absolutely. And so there's a question then, isn't there? And there's also the balance, I guess, and there are some sort of thoughts coming in here via the questions, but around whether does live matter in terms of an act of worship, or are you still watching a recording? Is that the same? And about the sort of reach and connection it does and doesn't enable with other groups. I don't know if any other further comments from some others of you on that sort of particular topic. I don't know what feedback you've had, Vicky, for instance, on that notion of, how have people been receiving the worship at a distance? You must have had some feedback, I guess.
Well, certainly, the reach is massive. I mean, we, even song live streamed from Selwyn, people are attending, probably enough, we get enough views that we couldn't actually hold that many people in the chapel, even if we didn't have a pandemic going on, which has been great. And I mean, some of the reach is legitimate, and I think they feel connected to the community. Alumni of the college who haven't been to chapel since 1953, because that's when they left Cambridge. My parents, who have never, I think, been to an in-person chapel service at Selwyn, because they've never been in the UK during term time. So, that's been really excellent about it. But I think, and I hope that we all aim not to produce, a sort of slick video, but actually to try and give, very much a virtual sense of what's going on. And I think somebody said earlier on the question and answer thing that it's here to stay, and I think that's probably true. But I think, therefore, it needs to be here to stay with all of its warts. So we had a cantor screw up at Evensong last week, and it's still there because that's what happened, and obviously if that cantor had said, please take this down, is but why is it any different? No one's going to go back and listen to it and make a meme out of it. Why is it any different if something goes wrong when you're in the building and it's online? So that we're getting used to things not being so slick, I think, and I think it's important that we try and keep them feeling authentic, even if it isn't actually real in real life.
Have any of you had encountered the realities of the kind of conversations that happen, particularly if you've got some musicians that you're paying in whatever way to do this, about conversations about fees and copyright? And I mean, there's several questions coming in about copyright, which we might pick up separately about streaming copyright. But generally, this notion of so musicians saying, but if I'm being broadcast, because in the days, you would say to your choir, well, if you're appearing on the BBC, like at the recent funeral, say from St George's, I will therefore charge a bigger fee. And now the notion of what broadcast means is sort of changed. I don't know if anybody have got any experiences they would find helpful, pending any discussions they've had.
We've agreed to postpone the discussion. So we have, I mean, we always had an external, at the Cathedral, the lay clerks were paid a bigger fee if a service was recorded or broadcast. And we have an agreement that with most services come down a week, they're up for a week and then they come down. So they're not sort of up there forever. And we have simply said that obviously the whole concept of live streaming and recording and stuff is different now, but we haven't increased their fee for your average Wednesday Evensong or whatever, but we will have that discussion as and when contracts are renegotiated, in the course of time. So we know it has to be had, but we haven't had it yet.
We're in the process of having those discussions here, and I know that there are discussions going on across the country with lay clerks and musicians, that I think it's really important that we do address that. And also one of our decisions here has been we're not going to live stream everything. We are going to, if you like, think about what we are live streaming, because I suppose we don't want to be in the situation where something has to be live streamed to make it have happened. In a cathedral context, worship happens day by day, 365 days a year, whether it's streamed or not. And again, I think it's sometimes good to pull back to the bigger purpose of what we're doing, that we worship, whether there are 2 people in the congregation, whether there are 10,000 watching online or 1,000 in the building. So I think that kind of, we could call it kind of cathedral thinking, because we're thinking kind of expansively about what we're doing, might help us in these discussions. But I think ensuring that our musicians are treated fairly and valued for what they're doing, and recognising the added pressure that inevitably comes from streaming. I think as a clergy person, I feel that as well, in terms of how I lead and perform worship. There's also that pressure for us, but I don't think I get an extra fee.
Before I ask Caroline about her opinion from the sort of singer's side, Vicky, I wonder, and this is just thinking about it, sort of as you were talking then about the sort of experience of joining worship online. Do you have any thoughts, by the way, about the different way that people might encounter watching services, especially if it's a Eucharistic one from home?
We've thought a great deal about this. When we started live streaming the Eucharist from the Minster, we thought we spent a lot of time reflecting on this theologically, spiritually, liturgically, and we made certain decisions in terms of where the camera was when we were distributing communion, because we didn't want to take away from the people in the building that very intimate moment. When they were sort of taking communion. So at those moments, we pan somewhere else. We have a still of a beautiful stained glass window. And we also encourage people to think about, if you like, as a way of connecting to communion spiritually, if they're on the other side of the world. And again, in our sort of whole programme of streaming, we're currently streaming the Eucharist and an evensong. So we're streaming both a service of the word and a service of sacrament to, I suppose, show the breadth of what we do here. So, but I think there are really interesting liturgical questions and spiritual questions about how we live stream something as personal as people taking communion, but others may have different opinions on that.
Does anybody on the panel have any views on that for now? Otherwise, we might have to say that. I mean, I have a feeling you could do a whole webinar on its own about the Eucharist on Zoom, but maybe, Anna.
I'll just say one tiny thing, which is that my parents have thoroughly enjoyed the fact that their church did takeaway Eucharist. And so I don't know how they managed it, but my parents had their little bit of bread and their little bit of wine, and they were sitting at home having it on the live stream. And I think they quite enjoyed the novelty of that. I don't know if it's necessarily the most environmentally friendly way to do it, but...
Caroline, your experiences, before we move on to another sort of topic here and think about and pick up this whole Zoom thing, your experiences as a sort of singer and the sort of the sense of you broadcasting and performing, and does that bother you, or are you just there and doing your own whatever? I know you sort of said it felt different being in front of the congregation in the building.
Yeah, so I would prefer to sing without being broadcast in front of a congregation of humans, live humans. But I think it's been nice to know that we were reaching people through the stream. And I think also for perhaps slightly vain, but also self-critical reasons, it's really helpful to re-listen to something that you've sung. I a couple of solo things that I did, I was able to re-listen to them, and I thought actually I noticed something listening to my own singing that I wouldn't have noticed whilst doing it, and then also listening to the choir. And I think sometimes when we're singing in a choir, we like to think that we know what it sounds like, and I think, at least I'm certainly guilty of this myself, I'll get carried away thinking, oh well, it's not sounding very good today, and it's all just going to be rubbish. And then actually, if you listen to your live stream, which is not a perfect performance, it's just what happened that was on the recording, often it sounds really great, and your perception of how it was from inside the choir. It can be very different because you're listening to your own part around you and the balance is different from where you're standing. And I've thought that before actually when I've been congregational rather than professional at the cathedral, and listening to the choir. I've had a different experience from the one you get when you're participating in it. And I think so there is some value in that. For the musician, there is some value in being able to revisit what you did and enjoy it, as well as the more self-critical aspect of it. But there is that. But I think I've watched and listened to quite a number of services actually on the YouTube channel for the cathedral, because I'm currently on maternity leave, and I find that I'm not as spiritually involved as I would be if I were in the building. So there's certainly something different about participating in a live stream or watching a recording, I think. But I agree it's here to stay as part of what we do to reach people.
Now, then the next thing, so moving the conversation on to pick up a different topic, otherwise we'll be out of time without covering some big things here. And here's something, so we're trying to look about hopes and visions for the future and about some of the ways that we can kind of absorb and plan. So a big one, obviously, now Sarah's already made sort of a view known on this about Zoom rehearsals. I think she said she never wants to take one ever again, and virtual choir. But let's have a little thought about some pros and cons. So I'm not going to go to Sarah first, because that would seem to be a foolish move at this point, because I have a feeling that might not open the discussion. Why don't we try Anna and talk about your experience about how that's been and any learnings from it, and obviously, and in fact I've just taken one of those rehearsals an hour ago, and I've had a great time rehearsing a choir that I couldn't hear a note. But does it lead to anything that's sort of helpful or sort of an end product when you assemble a recording that's sort of believable?
I think I have varying thoughts on this depending on who I'm working with. So with the chapel choir and the girls choir, we've been doing Zoom rehearsals weekly, and I think again the girls seem to kind of adapt to it slightly better in that they treated it as a social thing, and they were chatting away and being completely crazy like they always are, and it was quite fun. And the chapel choir, they were sort of more focused, and so I found it harder as a conductor. I say conductor, as a Zoom coordinator, because you don't get as much back in the same way. And we did manage to kind of learn new rep every week, learn in inverted commas, because some people pick it up on Zoom, some don't. We sort of got through a lot of rep, and with the girls we looked at Anglican chant, which they don't usually sing, and we started looking at some SATB rep that they wouldn't normally sing, because obviously we weren't preparing for services in the same way. So in a way there were positives. I would also say that I've been running this NHS choir with 1,000 NHS staff, and obviously the only way we've been able to do it is through virtual rehearsals, and the community there has been incredible, and so they can have their place, they can be not as soul destroying as I think they're going to be before. I always mostly come away from them actually thinking, you know what, it's not the same, but I really enjoyed that. But I think obviously we're all completely aware that there is just no substitute for being in a room together and breathing together and then singing together, and you can't teach that over Zoom. So it'll be interesting when the NHS choir can come together again, what it's actually going to be like to have all those people in the room at the same time.
What about any other thoughts from anybody else about how the whole Zoom world, which of course, 15 months ago, nobody had really bothered to try to take Zoom rehearsals, why would you? But now that we know how the pluses and minuses of that, is there an ongoing place for it as part of your work with your choirs, or your learning as a singer, or preparing people for worship, or not?
I might jump in quickly about preparing people for worship. We're intending to use the positive aspects of Zoom to engage with people for discussions and reflections on what worship is through the week. So I think there are uses for it in terms of teaching in any parish or cathedral. I think the team here have used Zoom for rehearsals during the lockdowns, and I think observing some of those rehearsals and going along and actually joining in myself, which was great to join in with the choristers, I found that there is something about discipline and habits and patterns which Zoom has allowed choirs to continue with throughout lockdown. So I think where that goes next, I think is anyone's guess, but certainly in terms of the teaching life of any church or parish, we're intending to keep on using it. But I completely acknowledge, as a singer myself, that rehearsing on Zoom is quite hard work when you're in a room on your own, without any of the voices who you love to sing with around you.
It is. It can be a slightly disarming experience, I suspect, isn't it? Can I put in briefly just here, though, a little plug to say one thing that might be that we as the RSCM have just kind of literally launched last week, which is a subscription you can subscribe now to as a choir to My Choral Coach, and I wonder whether there's a sort of hybrid thing here that might help, and the notion is that repertoire pieces are uploaded to this platform, and the choir trainer can say to the choir, right, we're going to practice, I don't know, choose a piece, If You Love Me. And so at home, then you've got guided things that you hear a recording of the choir and your part, and then you can practice your part and it tells you how you're doing. And you can submit in your recording to the choir trainer so they can see how you're doing. And I wonder if, of course, actually, if you get that right, whether there's a great potential that then when your choir comes back together, they kind of done this thing called homework and actually rehearse the music, so that then in the live situation you're able to actually enjoy refining music rather than going, it's a B flat, it's a B flat. And so because of course for a lot of people, you know, you can hand them the piece of music and say, go home and learn this, but actually they can't, because as a singer they don't have the skills for that. And actually has Zoom opened a possibility world for that, and things like this My Choral Coach that would help? Or do you think that could be helpful? Sarah's looking slightly less skeptical at this point.
Yeah, it probably could. I think, especially if I need to investigate this product, but I mean, especially if there's some feedback, because certainly my problem, that, you know, the whole point of having a conductor is that they have these, and they're able to say to a singer, you know, especially to the less experienced ones, not only this is how it goes, let's see if we can learn it together, but you haven't quite mastered what's going on in bar 12, or you've got the rhythm wrong in there. And actually they're blithely doing that happily, and so yes, I've got that. And of course they're in their living room by themselves, and actually maybe they haven't. And then you come back together and what you've got is 6 different versions of bar 12, because no one actually knew how it went. So actually that having that kind of feedback is what's important. And I didn't, you know, I was completely furloughed in the summer term from Ely. So and at Selwyn we did the virtual choir thing, not Zoom rehearsals. So I didn't actually take a Zoom rehearsal until January, even though many obviously of my colleagues had been doing that loads. And I was horrified at how unsatisfactory it was. And it wasn't until I mean, my sound actually collapsed halfway through, and I tried to play the piano and the girls couldn't hear me. And so I actually had to give up because my computer wasn't functioning. And I had my organ scholar who has perfect pitch. She was sitting without a piano, but I said, right, well, this office hymn that we're learning, we'll get Miriam to sing it. So she sang it and we sang along. So I then sat back and became one of the participants rather than taking the rehearsal. And, you know, that was easier. And I understood that, I mean, I still don't know whether all of the kids were getting it right, but at least I understood that, you know, you can hear them singing and then you can hear yourself singing. So there's some music going on, but when you're taking a Zoom rehearsal, you can't hear anything. And that's what I hated.
Any other thoughts on that from anybody? There's lots of nods and smiles, but any other thoughts before we move on to our other topic here?
Can I just say one thing really quickly?
Of course, yeah. Of course,
I think one thing that I did find really interesting and productive was seeing how everyone who was confined to Zoom was being so sort of, they're trying to think outside the box and think, okay, well, how can I keep the choir feeling a sense of identity and feeling like we belong in this special group and we can achieve productive things on Zoom. We're not just going through the motions and seeing loads of people sort of get guests in each week to talk for 10 minutes. I mean, we did this with our girls. We had various inspirational women coming to talk to them just about their careers. And I think seeing this idea of what it is to be in a choir expanding, I think I found that quite exciting.
Thank you, Anna. Now, just alert to the time. And why don't we just think about some top tips, as it were, from you about, from the four of you in different sets of response about repertoire and things that you think have been, I know some of you have talked a little bit about this already. Maybe Sarah, you'd kick us off here about things that you would encourage people to go down avenues of exploration where they feared to tread or just not had the opportunity to tread to this point. If you could sort of say to people, right, here's my top, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 things to do, a bit like on sort of the sort of jobs for the weekend thing that you get, what would you put on the list of things to try?
Right. Well, the first thing I would put on the list we've already mentioned, which is plainsong. It is absolutely beautiful, and it's okay on a day when, you know, half the choir is isolating at the last minute to sing the Magnificat to Tonus Peregrinus instead of trying to do the Bird Great service. That is okay. In fact, it's probably liturgically and spiritually more edifying to hear Tonus Peregrinus, and I have every intention of doing exactly that. On Easter Sunday, we did the Missa de Angelus at Selwyn because I only had 3 singers, and it was far more beautiful than even if we tried to do Bird 3, you know, and it was just, it's such good stuff, and it's in unison, and you can do it accompanied, and you can do it in English. It doesn't even have to be complicated. So that would be my first thing. Secondly, unison singing, which I think I mentioned earlier, especially if you're rebuilding a children's choir. Don't sing in 16 parts. Don't even sing in 2. Just sing in unison and rebuild the sound, the legato and the confidence. And a little bit more repetition for the next little while, if needs be, you know, especially if you're trying to rebuild a repertoire for a choir that sings a lot, and do easier things well and make the choir feel good about being together, especially if there are members of the choir that are anxious or nervous because of COVID, and because of, you know, reintegrating into society. You know, make them feel good about the experience, which means don't give them, you know, something ridiculously difficult, but sing something simple really well. That's my top tip.
Thank you. Let's keep going on the top tip line. Anna, in no reason other than that's the order on my screen. Anna, things that you would encourage people.
I think Sarah has basically just covered absolutely everything. I would second what she said about plainsong in particular. When we're trying to encourage people to think about line and ensemble singing, plainsong is one of the best ways to do that. The other thing I would say is I think doing something easy well is really, really important. But I've also found the flip side of that is people the students that I'm working with certainly don't seem to want me to give them an easy ride just because they've been having time off. And I realize those two things might sort of conflict slightly, but I don't think they should. I think it's more that they don't want my standards to have dropped. They want me to keep pushing and saying to them, actually, no, you could do that a little bit better. And I think that's a really interesting thing to try and juggle, whilst also thinking, right, I'm not going to make them sing Lo the Full Final Sacrifice when they haven't sung together for however many months.
So I think the connection point of what you said, Anna, is actually one of aspiration, isn't it, to hold those two things together? Yeah. Vicky?
Yeah, I'm going to third plainsong because I think that's a brilliant suggestion. I'm going to agree with everything that Sarah and Anna have said. And I think my tips are kind of simple, really, but they're what I've seen our music team developing here. And I think there is something about challenge as well as simplicity, and how you hold those two things together are really important. And also, I think for any kind of situation that you're in, you do what you can and not what you can't. And you remember what worship is for. And I think if you get that right, then everything else will flow from that.
Thank you, Vicky. And Caroline?
Well, I'll fourth all of that, but also I think what I would add is a reminder that choirs need to get to know each other again before they can sing confidently together again. I think singing is personal, and singing can be very high stakes because once you've done it, it's out there. And one of the things that makes singing enjoyable and makes singing easier is feeling like you know the people who are with you and they're not going to make fun of you make a mistake. So my 4-year-old constantly reminds me that teamwork makes the dream work. So I think it's important that we make sure there's time for choirs to get to know each other in person, either again or full stop, because choirs, like, so for example, college chapel choirs where there is turnover every year, people don't necessarily know each other, and that's part of singing well together. So that's the only thing I would add.
I mean, of course, you know, you just said it, Caroline, that, you know, that singing, it sounds obvious, but this whole discussion has been around singing, and somebody did put about their own church music group pre-recording things. Of course, some of these issues apply as much to instrumentalists if you've got a part of an instrumental group as they do to singers, actually. But this conversation has largely been concentrated on singing. But as you said, it is a sort of business of people. And do anybody have any? I'll try and make that a grammatical sentence. Does anybody have any thoughts on actually that ministering to the people in your choir as they begin to reconnect and you welcome them back into your space? Particularly, we had a question earlier about when will that resume, but some choirs in parishes I know, because I know some local examples here, that haven't actually been together for now more than 12 months, apart from an occasional online sortie. What issues are going to need to be confronted, and how can we help people deal positively with that sort of encounter?
I think, just to go back to what something that I mentioned briefly at the beginning, I think the importance of the individual cannot be overstated, because I think the thing I found with a couple of singers that I was working with, when I sat them down in a room by themselves and said, right, let's chat about it, how are you feeling? They said, I don't feel like I deserve to be here. Everyone else is so good. Everyone else has improved over the last year and I've just stayed the same. And I think everyone is feeling that sense of being left behind and isolation and all of this. And so taking that time as a director to sit with them individually, and yes, fine, that might mean that you lose an hour of email time, but I think it's far more important to make sure that the individuals within your choir are mentally happy, vocally healthy, and comfortable with what's going on.
Anybody else?
I think I'd echo all of that, and just to say, choirs are communities. They always have been, and they always will be. And in a sense, they're kind of another way of looking at what the church is, which is a community of people worshipping God together. So I think, pastoral care and support and encouragement are all part of what it means to be in a choir. So I think all people of all kinds of walks of life have had a challenging year, and I think that won't be any different to our church communities and our choir communities. So I think what Anna says is really important there. It's just kind of care and time and compassion.
Now, there was one of the very first things, the questions that came in was someone saying about, and it does say over here in the USA, but then asks about the government. So I guess that's connected with the UK government. But anyway, do the panel think that the recent press about proposals to cut funding for arts and the lack of government promoting the arts has made it more or less difficult to fulfil our work? Generally speaking, I suppose that means, let's perhaps frame that question in a slightly different way. Does all of this, do you think, make the job of making the case for music in worship and arts and things stronger or more complicated, because as in terms of the advocacy that we can show?
I think my concern with it, it makes it more difficult because it's obviously not a priority for the sort of powers that be. My main concern with this is that it's going to make the diversity issue in what we do even worse than it already is, and it's not terribly good. It's going to make it harder in universities where they go out of their way to have as diverse a student body as they can, like Cambridge, for example. So most of the students coming in have never been to church or ever sung in a choir, in a way that was not the case 30 years ago. And it's just, they're just pushing all of this into all of the arts and music making. Anyone who wants to do it seriously has to go to a private school because that's the only place where you can do it. So yeah, it's not helpful from a sort of social point of view, quite apart from what you think about the arts as a vocation.
Do the other three of you have anything to add on that particular one? No? Oh, no is the answer. Okay, so well, maybe we do that. And so, just as we ran out of time, thank you for everybody for the questions. There was one technical one came in about licensing thing and to understand where to do that. There are some details on the RSCM pages about licensing for streaming. If you go to the RSCM shop, then there are resources for that. What we'll try and do is send out in a follow-up to the people who signed up and registered and are here today. We'll send a link to the documentation that is there to help people navigate the slightly traumatic world of licensing for streaming. And
I did answer that one in the chat, and I don't quite know how that works for, like, not the chat, the Q&A. I don't know whether everyone can see that. But what we use at Selwyn is a PRS limited online music license, which costs about £150 a year and is supposed to cover everything for non-monetized YouTube videos, apparently.
So thank you for picking that one. That's why I couldn't find it, because you've already answered it, Sarah. That would account for it. No, just last words, because it's 3:15. Thank you for your time very much, everybody, today. And I hope you've it's been great to enjoy the conversation together and the chance to sort of share some thoughts. So let's go finishing with a bit of optimism and creativity, and what you're looking forward to over the next month, 6 months, year. Let's sort of inject a bit of, hey, you know, there's a bright new dawn as everyone begins to kind of sort of go out there and do things again. Vicky, let's start with you. Your hopes and the positive things that you think we can look forward to, and that you're either personally or generally.
Personally, obviously, I'm enjoying. I'm going to enjoy, I hope, getting to actually do my job in the building, but also experience the wonderful the choir here, work with the music team, enjoy the new organ that we have, which sounds fantastic, and also rebuild our liturgies and our worship. And I think that is actually exciting and something creative to do. That rebuilding and renewing can be a good thing. So I'm going to look forward to that.
Thank you. Who'd like to go next? Let's go with Caroline.
Yeah, I am looking forward to gradually losing precautions like screens, which has been the most frustrating thing for me, physically speaking. Just singing into a plastic screen is not my idea of perfect music making. And in the longer term, maybe Messiah at Christmas, or maybe a Passion next Easter, who knows? But being able to plan for things, I think, of being able to know what's coming, even just in a general sense, is starting to feel more likely. So.
Thank you, Caroline. And Anna?
I'm excited to see, now that we're sort of back and can sing together again, and there's this sense of everyone just really wanting to be singing in the room and seeing what they can do. I think I'm excited to sort of see how that progresses over the next term and see what sounds come out by the end of the academic year. But I think the thing that I'm most looking forward to is having a full-ish chapel, even if distanced, and singing a hymn with everyone just going for it, and having the feeling that we all know and love so well, where the choir is singing a descant over the top and everyone gets shivers. That feeling of collectivity is what I'm looking forward to most.
Yes, it's interesting. We've done a survey recently to which we had some 500 responses about sort of music and worship and things, and if we said if we could grant one wish right now, what would it be? And the overwhelming thing was exactly that, Anna. So by a country mile. Sarah, anything you finally thoughts from you?
Well, yeah, Anna's just said musically what I'm looking forward to most. I think I'm looking forward to the fact that apparently Boris Johnson's going to let us hug each other. That seems so kind of bizarre that the government is dictating that. And actually, just on a purely personal level, I'm looking forward to not feeling like I might be doing something wrong if I want to invite someone over for dinner. We used to have people over for dinner. That used to be like one of the things that we like to do. And we haven't done that for a year and a half. And it just feels so weird and wrong. And actually it feels, why don't you pop over for a meal? It'd be great. Like, that's normal, and I can't wait till that is normal again.
Absolutely, indeed. So what a nice way to finish. So thank you ever so much for your time to the four panelists who've been here today, to Sarah and to Anna and to Vicky and to Caroline. This if you want to watch this back, this will be available. Do stay in touch via other things that are coming up via the RSCM website. If I can just finish by saying this webinar was completely free. The RSCM, though, we don't receive any money to keep us going, and surprise, surprise, we've been badly affected in terms of our income like everybody else. If you felt able to offer a thank offering, then going to our website and hitting the donate button at the top, we would very, very much appreciate it. But it's been lovely to see them together, the panelists, lovely to spend time with them, lovely to have the audience with us here today, and I really wish you a very happy rest of the Monday, and we look forward to seeing you again. So thanks to all of the panel, and thank you to all. Goodbye.